So hello everyone, super excited to be here and to be talk about operations. So we have talked about science today, DAOs, bio-DAOs, IP, but not necessarily operations. So we'll have the chance to talk about what actually means operations, I mean, like more traditionally, but in Web3 and in a DAO. So I think I'm going to jump right into it. James did a good job introducing you. So one day, I'm curious to from your perspective, like what actually means operations for you? And I'm talking about more in general. And the reason I'm asking is because I think a lot of the times, I'm sure that the three of us have three different definitions of what ops mean in an organization. So I'm curious to hear yours, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I think often operations is viewed as like a siloed department that might have HR or legal or finance within it, but I like to view it more as a force that's integrated throughout an organization. So if an organization is a human body, I consider operations to be like the circulatory system. So it's what makes sure it kind of delivers the blood and that force to, thank you, to everyone, and make sure that all the different departments are working well together, different working groups, et cetera, are working well together. And the reason I like that definition is because it applies to any type of organization. Because in general, people are people, whether it's a DAO, whether it's traditional operations, there's always this common idea of like, how do you encourage the right behavior, and operations does that.
Friederike, in your opinion, like how do you see operations? Yeah.
This was way more poetic than I could have put it. So I was going to say, for me, operations is kind of the creation and maintenance of the framework to actually allow the organization to kind of build things and shape things.
That's an interesting point, because like all organizations need to live under like some kind of framework. It's not an open canvas, right? You come in and there are a set of values, goals, and then they're like a little bit more structure. So then operations make sure that that works. In your perspective, Web2, Web3 operations, what are the main differences? Yeah, how do you compare both?
I think kind of when you move from Web2 to Web3 and kind of you have a traditional Web3 company, I think the way that operations work are minimally different. But obviously kind of if you're kind of asking about like DAOs, operations kind of work very differently. Sometimes they don't work. So I think kind of if you kind of look at DAOs, you have to differentiate between different kinds of DAOs, right? So kind of there are the patient interest group DAOs that we talked about earlier, where people are kind of aligned on a topic and kind of what they want to see happen and kind of have interest or stake in that. And then there's DAOs that strive to replace traditional companies or protocols or products, and those, I think I want to see them work in due course, but I think currently the way that they work is suboptimal. Some barely work, to be honest. So yeah, so I think kind of you kind of have to differentiate a lot between different use cases here.
And let's go into DAOs specifically. You mentioned like DAOs, and you also mentioned protocols. Like, what do you think that is not making them work as optimal as they should be?
I think kind of we have a lot of experience in kind of how to make groups that are co-located or that kind of know their names and kind of have strong relations between the individual people, how to make those work as a team. I think making a much more fluid set of people where kind of you can transition in and out easily without any barriers, making that work, where you have pseudonymity, you don't necessarily know who's who, kind of people can create a second profile and so on. I think kind of getting that to work is a lot harder. On one hand, because kind of the ways of kind of attacking that system in a way are much more plentiful. But also on the other hand, because we don't have as much experience with these kinds of setups.
Yeah, it's like coordination, it's like decision making, it's like timelines, everything at the same time, very different from what we had before. Wande, you had experience in Web2, consulting, and now with Molecule. It's like Web3, but not necessarily a DAO, right? But I think you are also like learning and also implementing a lot of the DAO mindset into Molecule. But I'm curious to see, like, do you agree with this vision? And what do you think is like working well and not so well?
I agree to an extent. I mean, maybe my slightly contrarian take is that I think one of the reasons that DAOs can fail in operations is because in trying to be disruptive, we might be throwing out too much of the traditional ops that actually works. I mean, we have decades or centuries of information telling us things about human behavior. And how to incentivize people. And I think simply because we've created a new structure that's more autonomous doesn't mean we need to get rid of some of like the best practices that still work. So when I think of a DAO, especially in its very early stages, it's very similar to an early stage startup. You still need that core team. I think Tyler talked about this earlier. And it's really important that we still consider some of the things that are necessary just in general business. So that would be my take.
Yeah, but then kind of my contrarian take would be that basically in a situation where you have a small group of closely knit founders who, without kind of token dynamics and so on, yet that isn't really open. That's a DAO in name only. So basically kind of having, to me, a DAO is something that is truly open to kind of anyone. And I think kind of building structures that work for that, I don't think it's been achieved yet.
I would agree with that. I think what I would add is that decentralization is a spectrum. There are many companies now, or many DAOs now, that started simply as companies, whether it's Uniswap Labs or whatever. So they have some startup behind them, even though there's also a DAO where you can propose things in their governance structure, et cetera. So I think the solution is probably something in between, something to kind of blend the two. Even if you're starting a DAO, it might not be the same as closely knit founders in a startup, but there probably are going to be some founding stewards, some people that have the ability to dedicate the amount of time that they would as they would to any other business. Because if it's just completely treated as a side project and just completely treated as like a hobby or something, it's going to be really hard to maintain that momentum. But if you have some core people, it allows for the fluidity within the rest of your organization.
I would agree to that, and I think one of the most fundamental misunderstandings about DAOs is that people think that all DAO members are the same. And I mean, so basically they are the same when they enter, but kind of you can make yourself much more indispensable than the average DAO member, and you should have a lot more say than the average DAO member. And kind of this notion that there shouldn't be a hierarchy in a DAO, to me that's nonsense. I don't think that's gonna work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's not going to be as hierarchical as like a corporation, but you decentralize decision making, it comes at a cost. So if you allow every single decision in a DAO to be made by consensus, especially if it's a really large DAO, it's going to be hard to do anything, and you're going to move really slowly in an area where you're trying to be disruptive. So the DAO does kind of need to empower certain people to have a greater say, and that can be through voting, but you're voting to say, okay, we enable and empower these people to make decisions, for example.
I think one part of the ops work has to do with contextualizing decision-making, contextualizing the work that we are doing. And I remember, like, for example, when we started the AthenaDAO, a lot of people were coming to us just like, let me know what to do. But like we were still building that context, right? And it was hard for us to just give work to everyone that would come to us. But sometimes that's the expectation, right? While in a startup, there's like the recruitment process. A lot of people look at the DAO as like a place that they can jump in and jump out, whatever you want. And for you as ops to actually plan a little bit the work that we are doing, it becomes hard. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about fluidity, right? So how can we create systems that are very fluid, that work no matter like a little bit like who is in it, but still each of us can actually bring our individual contributions. And I think that's a challenge that I agree, like we haven't figured out. I think we are, I wouldn't say like far away, but I think there are signs of other organizations that have done it, right? So when I look at, for example, Automatic, the founders, like the creators of WordPress, they are, I think it's like almost 2,000 people organization, completely remotely, where no meetings, right? So where people just like, there's like a lot of,
but that's not a DAO. Right?
No.
So I mean,
but,
basically, to me, kind of 2,000 people that are known but work remotely. That's very much on the company end of the scale.
What I was saying, like there are learnings from that structure that we can implement. But I think as DAOs, I think we are still far away from actually having that fluidity and flexibility and agility that you were saying to actually get things done.
I think I would still go back to traditional operations on this, where I generally believe that operations and structure, they're just the right amount needed, allows a lot more freedom, whether it's creative thinking, strategic thinking. If you nail down the basics and you're doing that efficiently, it gives you more room to do other things. And I think similarly in a DAO that if you have the right processes and structure in place, which still need to be figured out, but for that core team, even if they change, it's almost like the standard business continuity problem that you would have in any organization where you don't want to have a single point of failure, et cetera. So if you build systems with that in mind, keeping in mind that anyone could leave at any time, and this is what a lot of asynchronous organizations have to do, I think that would be a path forward for DAOs to help solve this problem.
Do you have like specific like things that you believe that DAOs could do? Because I think a lot of people are here are either they are DAO contributors, they are thinking about building maybe a bio DAO. Like what is like the specific things that you believe that from day one they should care about?
I would say first and foremost, make sure that you start the DAO with partners that are fully committed. As much as you can ensure that, and make sure that they have the time. Similarly, you would not want to start a startup with someone who just took on a new job that's 60 hours a week and then has all other commitments and consults and all of that. DAOs take time, and the other thing is they take time, and you often don't get rewarded in money, at least immediately. So I think it's really important to have a strong founding team. And the way to get that is that they're really passionate about the cause. And I think we've seen that at least in the bio DAOs. So it's a lot of sweat equity. And I think just like with any organization, starting with that really strong team is probably the key to like the first thing to do on day one.
Do you have also any suggestions, advice?
It's super difficult because there are so many different things that kind of you could, in principle, give advice about, right? So basically, one of the things I think that are always good advice, whether for organizations that are traditional or organizations that are transitioning into kind of a DAO setup, or organizations that started as DAOs, I think transparency is key for many things. So kind of get into the habit of being transparent about things, and consistency also usually helps. But then, so basically the thing that kind of sets individual DAOs apart from one another, I think, is culture. And I'm with Wande in that I think kind of the founding team really has a really large mark to make here.
And I think the other thing I would add is the incentive structure. That's probably the main difference between like traditional ops and DAO ops and just companies and DAOs. The incentives are very different. There's a potential for diffusion of responsibility and accountability when you don't have people basically legally obligated by contract to show up at a certain place for a certain number of hours. So I think aligning incentives also in a way that works with the DAO's goals is really important. And it could be through tokens, it could be through bounty programs. It really depends on what the DAO is focused on.
I think like something that I think like DAOs of course like offer like a different incentive structure, but I think for example BioDAOs specifically, I think it's important that you attract people that are also mission aligned, right? And I think that incentives, culture, and mission are three things that I believe they need to be actually very close together. And I feel like a lot of the times, I think like last year, for example, it was very easy for a DAO to just like get hundreds of people coming in, but it's just like, there's like looking for bounties, looking for this, but not necessarily even caring about what actually the work that we're trying to do. And I think that where culture also makes a big difference, right? So, but like, how do you think about culture building in DAOs? Yeah, I'm curious to hear from both of you, like culture in DAOs and how can be built, because like in traditional startups, usually the culture comes from the founders, right?
I think this goes for DAOs too. So basically, I think for DAOs, the culture comes from the founding team and kind of how you interact with the larger DAO, how much you tell about the rationale behind certain decisions, how much you kind of involve people. I think it's no different than in traditional organizations. I think something that sometimes doesn't happen in DAOs is kind of policing culture to a certain extent, so calling out people for kind of rubbish behavior. Obviously, in traditional organizations, this happens. I think in DAOs, it kind of needs to happen more.
And I think I would also add that regardless of the organization, culture evolves. It might start one way, but it's going to change. And the founding team, but also all the community members have a say in whether or not that change is for the better or for the worse. So I think part of it is almost like how people are onboarded into the DAO, who you initially kind of invite to your community. If you're approaching degens versus scientists versus, I don't know, maybe patient communities, et cetera. I think who you market to and who you essentially attract to the DAO makes a big difference in culture. So if you start early with that onboarding part, you can really help guide the culture.
I think one of the challenges that we have as DAOs is it's true that you can market it to different communities, right? And then you onboard these different communities, but then in the end you actually have a big group of people. They might be mission aligned, incentive aligned, but they also have very specific needs. Like if you are a researcher, if you are like someone, in our case, like someone with a specific women's health condition, or if you are like a funder, or if you are a Web3 enthusiast that wants to understand like if this site can work. So I think like people also come to us with different backgrounds, different needs, and I think like ops and also like of course the working groups have an important role to make sure that there's like a value proposition, a value for each one of the for each one of the different stakeholders, right? And I think that's actually sometimes a challenge.
I think that's not true. I think sometimes kind of making sure that your scope is narrow and stays narrow is important for success, because if you try to do too many things at once, so kind of speak to the people with specific conditions and the founders and so on, try to incorporate them all, kind of the thing that often gets left behind is the initial vision and mission, and then it's a collective of people who sit in a Discord.
No, I think that there's a big difference between having a strong community and having people on the Discord, right? So, but I also think that, at least from what we are seeing, is that you don't really control who is coming in. Basically what you want is like to onboard and give an experience. We have been actually very focused on like who is the initial group that we are trying to onboard and add value to. But I think as we grow, we'll attract other people that comes with different profiles. And I think like, it's true that we cannot forget the mission, but I think it's also true that we'll have to create value for each one of them. And I think that it might not be immediately, it might be something that we do in the long term, but I think that's something that will be requested from us.
I think one thing to consider is also scaling, and that's what affects culture, but also other aspects. I think DAOs have to plan for scaling much sooner than a startup would, because when you go from, I don't know, maybe start with 20 people, then 1,000, then 10,000, and that there's that culture change, but it also just affects other aspects of operations. So I think addressing all the aspects of scaling would include this cultural component.
But in DAOs with 20,000 members, how many of them are actually active members?
Just a few.
Yeah, there you go. And I think in that sense, it doesn't really change, right?
Yeah, well, I think there are different ways to encourage activity, but it matters like which few are active. And it's not always the largest token holders, for instance, who are the most active, but you can encourage delegation, you can do different things to try and get people to be more active, but it is true that like in really large DAOs, everyone does not participate.
Yeah, so I think things we absolutely need to build for DAOs, kind of DAO tooling that we have to have, kind of some sort of reputation modules, so that kind of whatever, so basically your history with this DAO should have some sort of impact on how your vote is weighted. And then secondly, I think the thing that we kind of need is ZK technology for kind of attestations and kind of making sure that things are heard, and are heard even from people whom they wouldn't necessarily be heard from otherwise. So kind of in a way obfuscating the identity, but then obviously the reputation comes in again, right? So basically if you have someone who has a really large reputation and wants to make some sort of outrageous proposal that they don't want to do under their assumed name, they can do this in that fashion. I think kind of those two primitives, they will really kind of bring DAO governance and DAO operations forward.
I wanted to go back to, I think we also mentioned about transparency, right? And I think that's one of the big differences between Web2 ops or more traditional ops and DAOs ops. I think companies over the years have become more transparency internally and externally, but I would like to also to see, like, in terms of like, in your experience, like how, like, you mentioned like the sharing the rationale behind the decisions is a way to be transparent, right? But I think a lot of the times, like, and we have seen it recently where people are suspicious of everything, right? And they want to have information, but like how to make sure that as a DAO and specific on operations, you are able to provide that information, and how to make sure that you build operations around transparency.
I think transparency is almost inherent to DAOs and Web3 and crypto and blockchain. I mean, the whole idea to me is that you don't have to trust people because of the transparency. There's almost this like trade-off, which is a bit different than traditional operations where the two can almost be synonymous. In DAOs, because you're working with people you don't necessarily trust, you have to create that transparency. Well, it's not just about voting, it's about being able to see where the DAO funds are going, et cetera. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways, but it's almost as if I would say a DAO needs to be transparent across the board, with the exception of situations where they vote or elect certain people and empower them to make decisions. Maybe that entire decision-making process doesn't need to be open to the DAO, but at least like the conclusion and the reason should be shared. So it's almost like transparency is like the #1 tenet to me with the culture of a DAO when you're starting it, and it's part of the Web3 ethos.
I know that I said you need transparency earlier, and I stand by that, but I think there is such a thing as too much transparency, and there's also transparency trolls who kind of take up precious bandwidth of the DAO by kind of asking for much more information than they could possibly need. And I think kind of, you know, putting a stop to that and kind of saying, okay, look, the DAO has decided this way, and that's good enough. I think that's fine. So I think kind of putting a limit to that and kind of not letting yourself as a DAO, as, you know, in principle, open organization be abused by random people who kind of come by. I think this is very important. Yeah,
I think that's true. And when a DAO is electing people to certain roles within the DAO, I think that is perhaps more based on trust, and you elect them because you trust them to make the right decisions, and in that case you don't require as much transparency, but it can take time to get to that point, but I completely agree with what you said.
Final question before opening up to the audience. I think like looking ahead, you mentioned like what kind of tools that we need to build, but looking ahead, like what do you like to see in terms of tooling, in terms of like ways of looking at ops inside of Web3, but DAO specifically? Like what you think are the main trends, or how do you envision the future of ops in DAOs?
Do you want to go first? Because I think I already...
Sure. I mean, the future of ops, like, there's definitely going to be tooling, and this isn't just for DAOs, this is for crypto companies. It's still really difficult for a crypto company to find a bank, to find a tool that integrates fiat transactions with crypto transactions, et cetera. And I think DAOs are going to be going through this same process. For instance, with hiring, maybe it's bounties through D-work, maybe it's, and hiring might not be the right word to use for DAOs, but you are bringing people onto the team. So I definitely think they're tools that span HR, legal, finance, et cetera, that would definitely improve DAO operations. But I think a lot of it is communication. Right now, like many people consider Discord to be synonymous with a DAO. I think that's going to have to change a bit. Like it's really those are communities, but a social media platform does not equal a DAO community. Like the community is much broader. So I would love to see tooling that fully integrates all of these aspects beyond just a place to chat and different servers and channels, et cetera.
I remember this morning Paul mentioned that building a DAO and building a bio DAO is super hard, and I think has also in part is the fact that we are missing the tooling, right? And the tools that you were mentioned for legal, finance, are things that we are struggling every day. Everyone that is building something, I think they struggle. Fortunately, like we are seeing those happening, right? So, and I think that's really great. But I think if you want to really increase the number of bio DAOs in the future, I think they need better tooling, but also kind of like a blueprint for how to at least get things started out of the ground. Because for startups, we know they're very well, right? But for DAOs and bio DAOs, that's not the case. And then go from there. You want to add?
Yeah, so I think the tools that we desperately also, I mean, so the reputation tool that I talked about, then generally kind of anonymize. Tools for making stuff anonymous. Yeah, and I think also better kind of DAO reporting tools. So I think even if in principle everything is on chain, kind of taking apart DAO financials super hard. So kind of, yeah, that would be super.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Cool. Now, open up to the audience. Any questions? Go ahead.
I'll bring you a mic.
Yeah.
I got you.
So I guess to prime this question, a lot of people talk about tooling, but very few people acknowledge or are cognizant of the people-related issues inside a DAO. And so I'm very interested in the touch points between operations and HR, or what comes to contributor dynamics. And what are some guiding principles you use in your operations, and your favorite thinker around the topic? Please share anything that you use to get started with these kinds of problems.
Well, I think you definitely highlighted a key point. For me with operations, it goes in order of priority: people, process, and tools. Usually it's about the behavior you want people to engage in and how you encourage it. You create a process in order to deliver on that, and tools are there to enable. So it's really important to not start with the tools, as you said. And I think when working with contributors, this is probably the biggest difference between DAOs and startups or companies, where you have people kind of moving in and out and contributing in different ways. I think one important thing is to accept that there is a transient nature to it versus a corporation or startup. I think the other thing is to make sure incentives are aligned. And I think one key aspect, whenever you can, pay people. It makes a big difference in terms of getting quality output and making it delivery-based. So I really love bounty programs, or sometimes grant programs, depending on what it is, but where you see the quality of the work, and then you pay the person, that builds their reputation and it builds the relationship, because if they are compensated adequately, whether in tokens or tokens for the DAO or other tokens, or perhaps even fiat, depending on what the situation is, I think that makes a big difference. And then the other aspect is treating people with respect, which I know should be incredibly obvious, but sometimes you see in Web3, because of the transient nature, there sometimes isn't that desire to build any relationship. And in my view, again, starting with people, building that relationship, treating contributors with respect, valuing what they add is a great way to attract top contributors and have them come back.
That's great. Do you want to add to?
No. That was an awesome answer.
Go ahead.
Just keeping going on this topic related to people relationship. Sorry. Let me rephrase. Continue on this topic of people relationship. One of the greatest challenges of all startups is to find and retain talent. So when you're speaking about contributors and also transient contributors, what do you think that's going to be the game changer to give those people the trust to be like keep contributing and not being like stolen for any big pharma corp?
I think that's culture and conviction. So basically, if you look at, well, first of all, the pool of potential contributors to a DAO is much larger than for most companies, because most companies don't consider hiring in many jurisdictions and so on. So basically, first off the bat, kind of, it's a much larger pool. And then, so basically, if you make the people believe in what you're building, they won't be easily lured away. And if they are, this is probably also a good thing for them, but also for you, right? Because you enabled them to kind of, they contributed and kind of they get an awesome job elsewhere. You're happy for them, right? I think this is kind of part of the culture of building a startup, and we have that in traditional startups too, right? So basically, you have just raised funding and you're kind of employing 10 people. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Google comes knocking and one of them leaves. It's what happens, and it's fine.
And I think I would also add to that, the financial incentives, again, are still really important. Culture and commitment is great, but you can't pay your rent in culture, right? So I think when people have that conviction to the mission, especially if they're paid in the DAO tokens, it encourages them to work harder and to deliver value to the DAO, which increases the price of the DAO tokens, which they hold. So it becomes this kind of cycle that encourages top contributors to keep contributing.
I think time for a final question. No question. No. Okay. We'll end here. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.